Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I was thinking about starting with a prayer, but I didn't have a chance to write one, and it's not something I do a lot of, like publicly. So we have just come from church where we did some praying, so I'm hoping that will do the trick. Okay. So I'm going to start off by making some introductions. I am thrilled and very thankful to have Pamela with us today. Not only is Pamela one of my favorite people in the whole world, she is a phone line supervisor for the National Overdose Response Service and a casual harm reduction worker at a community health center here in Ottawa. I am Ruth Fox, and I am a member of OUC and one of the Ontario directors for Moms Stop the Harm. Moms Stop the Harm is a network of Canadian families impacted by substance use harms that advocates for changes to failed drug policies. Moms Stop the Harm also provides peer support to grieving families and to those with loved ones who are using or have used substances. I've brought some brochures and rack cards for anyone who is interested in more information. And you can also find us on the internet at www.momstoptheharm.com. So quickly, I'll just go over the objectives of the session. Thank you. Essentially, what we'd like to do is provide an overview of what harm reduction means in the context of drug use. There's a lot of information circulating around, much of which is frankly inaccurate and misleading. So what I'm hoping you will leave today with is an understanding of what harm reduction is and maybe question some of the things you hear in the media. We'll talk about why harm reduction is important, and also what harm reduction is not. I just wanted to note that we recognize that the landscape around drug policy and drug use is complicated, and while we may touch on some related issues, the focus today is harm reduction. I'm going to hand it over to Pamela now, who's going to talk about some housekeeping points.
Hi. It's been about 15 years since I've spoken in front of a church community, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm just going to lay out, don't think of them as rules, but let's think of them as agreements for engagement. So we're going to share some information. We're going to leave some time for questions and answers. This first part of information sharing is going to be recorded, but we're not going to record the questions and answers part. Did you mention the resource list? Not yet. Okay. So Ruth and I prepared a list of local resources for anyone who might be experiencing substance use, might be feeling any type of way after this presentation. I'm also available. I'm not a therapist, but I'm super comfortable with all sorts of feelings. I have a social service worker diploma, and I'm actually doing my master's of social work. But I'm not a social worker, not a therapist. So come find me after if you want to chat about anything that is more support related. And just in terms of we're here to talk about harm reduction in the context of substance use. So I'm not a big fan of content warnings, so to speak, but you've been told about what the content is. I also just ask that folks are super respectful of both myself, Ruth, your extended community. You don't know who in your life is using drugs. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of people in this room have experienced loss related to substance-related harms. So we ask that everyone just proceed super mindfully and from a place of love for each other. And if anger comes up for you, I'll take it, but don't direct it towards each other. Bring it at me because I'm a visitor and I can take it. So, also if you need to step out, step out. No one's gonna chase you, but I if people just kind of give a little wave and let us know you're okay. I can't chase you, but maybe, again, take care of each other and we'll do our best to take care of you. And in return, you have to be nice to me and Ruth. Okay. I'm going to give it back to Ruth, and she's going to talk about what harm reduction is as a concept, because it doesn't just apply to drugs. We do harm reduction for ourselves every day of our lives, and you probably don't even know you're doing it. So, come on up.
Thank you, Pamela. I'll just point out that the resource list that Pamela referenced is on the piano bench over there. There's about 20 copies, so help yourselves if that would be useful. So the concept of harm reduction is not new. In its most literal sense, and pardon the simplification, it is reducing harm. That's what harm reduction is all about. Life is full of risks and possible risks to health and safety, and in its broadest sense, harm reduction aims to mitigate those risks. We've been using harm reduction measures for a long time in many contexts. For example, we wear a life jacket when we're boating or swimming to reduce the risk of drowning. We wear helmets when we're biking, skiing, or motorcycling to reduce the risk of head injury in an accident. There's medication for people with high blood pressure to reduce the risk of heart attack or stroke. Insulin for people with diabetes to reduce the risk when blood glucose levels drop below normal or acceptable range. An EpiPen to reduce the risks associated with an anaphylactic allergic reaction, which is also a tongue twister, and many others. So those are just a few examples, and before moving into talking about harm reduction in the drug use context, I wanted to just sort of set the stage about the drug use context itself. So as we all know, some substances are legal and regulated. For example, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis. We know what is in these substances, and because they are regulated, if or when an issue arises, immediate action is taken to remove the products in order to keep people safe. Other substances are illegal and criminalized. For example, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. These substances are not regulated, and as such, nobody is checking for content or potency. Prohibition of a substance opens the door to the underground production and distribution of the substance. We have organized crime, and the iron law of prohibition is a theory which says that essentially the stronger the enforcement, the more potent the substance is. Ironically, these so-called controlled substances are not controlled at all. They are unregulated, unsafe, and causing harms and death. So now I'll turn it back to Pamela, who's going to talk about harm reduction in the drug use context. Pamela.
This is one of my favorite things to talk about. Who remembers the Nancy Reagan, just say no? Who remembers DARE, the egg on the front, this is your brain on drugs? So scary, right? If you use drugs, you'll die. And then we all went on to try binge drinking. And then we all went on to try smoking cigarettes. And some of us even tried cannabis. And some other people might have gone on to do other things like heroin, crack, cocaine, whatever. So, not the most effective campaign. It was scary. It caused people to hide their substance use. But I don't think it deterred a lot of people from actually using drugs. My opinion, maybe some researchers' opinion. So harm reduction in a drug use context kind of accepts that folks are going to use drugs. There's a certain amount of drugs that work for people, and there's a certain amount of drugs that can cause serious harms to people. So that's kind of the framework that I'm coming from, is that substance use is inevitable. On a scale of, maybe this is a neutral, fine thing that I can have in my life. Maybe this is ruining my life or killing me. And you know what? Maybe there's a time when we can use a substance to enhance our life. So again, that's my frame of reference when talking about drug use. And so there's three kind of ways to look at harm reduction. So the first one is as a broad social justice movement. So saying that people who use drugs are humans, and human life is really important. and that there's basic human rights that folks are just awarded because they're human, with or without any type of relationship with substances. So like, people deserve to live lovely, healthy lives. There's also harm reduction context kind of in like a service provision kind of way. So you might hear a therapist say, I take a harm reduction approach. And so what that means is when folks come to me as a therapist, which I'm not, but this is an example, with any sort of concern, we're gonna make steps to make that more healthy in your life. And then there's harm reduction as like day-to-day practices. So as Ruth said, putting on your seatbelt every time you drive your car, right? You're reducing the harm of you flying through that windshield if, heaven forbid, you get in an accident. Everyone tracking? Yeah? Okay. So harm reduction kind of historically has a link to the HIV and AIDS pandemic. So how do we reduce the risk of HIV transmission to keep people alive and to stop them from suffering? And it's actually based in some research evidence. So it does, when people use harm reduction practices, they tend to live longer, healthier lives. And I know I'm talking a lot, but there's no one solid single definition of harm reduction either. So what harm reduction actually looks like in my life might look totally different than how that plays out in someone else's life. But at the end of the day, it's about reducing harm of whatever behavior. So yeah, I'm just gonna check my notes. There's some different organizations put forth different principles. So Katie, who is kind of like, it's an organization, not a person. They're kind of Canada's resource for HIV and hepatitis C information. So they produce a lot of materials about how to reduce harms related to substance use, both from like getting your drugs checked to how do you smoke safer or how do you inject safer. And they really focus on the health of people who use drugs from a public health approach. Meeting people where they're at, accepting that drug use is not avoidable in society, different things like that. And then there's an American source that I really like called the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and their principles really include like people's relationship with substances is complex, it's multifaceted, it's not one size fits all, and like how do we ensure wellness? And then they come with that nothing about us without us kind of framework, so that every program, every initiative, every intervention should come with the expertise of people with lived experience. And that's how I try and practice too. Okay, let's talk about what harm reduction is not. So it's not giving children's drugs. I'll start with that. It's not encouraging people to start using drugs. At the safe injection site that I work at, there's no minimum age requirement, but we will ask people questions. Is this your first time injecting? Have you used this substance before? Okay, you're 16. Where did you get these drugs from? Is there an adult in your life who's either encouraging you to use these? Maybe there's a nefarious thing going on, and we look into that, but we're not gonna say, get out of here, kid, drugs are bad, because if they're determined to use that substance, they're gonna do it behind a dumpster rather than in a safe, sterile location. There's also a lot of talk about safe supply and safe supply diversion. Do folks know what safe supply is? Anyone know what safe supply is? Okay, oh, very cool. A couple people. So safe supply is this idea that some folks are so dependent on substances that they're spending all their time, energy, and resources into acquiring substances that are very unsafe, very unregulated. And so there's pharmaceutical alternatives. So if somebody is using street fentanyl every single day, multiple times a day, then sometimes there's doctors who can prescribe an alternative, so like a Dilaudid, which is what you might receive after a surgery. You're still able to manage the cravings, remove your body pain, and then you can go about on your daily life. Controversial, maybe, to some people. But I've seen that practice in place. There are concerns that people might be selling their Dilaudid or their morphine. And like, this isn't anything new. There's lots of folks who, like, we tend to direct this negative energy towards folks who are unhoused, but there's lots of kids who are raiding their parents' medicine cabinets. And so, you know, like, is diversion new? Is the sharing or stealing of pills new? It's not. It's also not handing out free drugs. So, like, at a supervised consumption site, people have to bring their own drugs. They're pre-obtained. And it also doesn't stop people from accessing treatment or delayed treatment. There's things that delay treatment, such as like underfunding, not enough beds. I'll call you back in 3 days, but you sleep outside and you don't have a cell phone. So that delays treatment. But harm reduction tends to actually bring people into services where there's staff and community that can connect them with services. They can see role models who are in recovery maybe and decide like, oh, cool, like a year ago we were using together and now you work here. So it can provide some role modeling. Okay. So I mentioned some examples of harm reduction strategies, but I'll list off my top couple ones that I use often. So education about overdose, what it is, what it looks like, and naloxone, which is a drug that reverses opioid overdoses, where you can get naloxone, where you can get safe, new, sterile equipment to use drugs, the existence of supervised consumption sites and overdose prevention sites, different safe supply, which we discussed earlier. There's also treatments in addiction medicine called OAT, methadone, Suboxone, Sublocade. How do I explain this? It gives your brain something to uptake, an alternative to an opioid that reduces your cravings for opiates. And sorry, opiates are pain medications. They have some side effects. So heroin, fentanyl, morphine are all opiates, and while they do a great job of reducing pain, they also do a great job of slowing down your respiratory system, which, you know, there's a balance. Like, you want to reduce your pain, but you don't want to reduce your breathing to the point where you have an adverse event. Another example of harm reduction is safe locations to use, so where there's running water, where you're inside, where there's someone spotting you, and where there's good lighting so that if you are injecting, you're not missing your veins. And harm reduction can also just look like giving someone a bottle of water. Like, if someone's been up for 4 days because they've been using continuously, like, here's a water and a sandwich. Like, it's time to take a nap, you know? Sleeping can be harm reduction. Socks in the winter, hand sanitizer, hand warmers. Okay, so why is this important? So I live downtown, and I don't know what the visibility of substance use is out in Orleans. We assume it applies to homeless people, but the majority of folks who are dying of substance-related harms are housed. That's the reality in Canada. The largest demographic is people who work in construction and trades, who are housed. So shift your mindset. Maybe there's some stereotypes about who is using drugs and for why, but opiates are pain management medication. So if you're breaking your body all day at work, maybe that's like a reasonable coping strategy. Okay, so Canada is having a toxic drug crisis. Like, people are dying a lot from using drugs. There's an unregulated supply. It's not an addiction crisis. It's an unregulated drug supply crisis. Treatment is important for people who are ready for it, but if folks aren't ready for it, they shouldn't be dying while they're waiting. And I believe that, like, quite passionately. I'm a big public health nerd, love humans, real big fan of social justice, and I just truly believe in, like, helping keep each other alive and healthy and safe, even if folks are making choices that I might not personally make for myself. That's not a reason why someone should be dying. And I'm speaking quite directly because, like, I see this every day, and, like, it's not It's not just my clients who are passing away, it's my coworkers, it's my friends, and it makes me really angry and really sad because I believe there's another way. Okay, cool. I think I covered all my points through that kind of passionate rant. Yeah, just gonna check my notes. Oh, there's also a ton of politics behind harm reduction. Like, everyone wants to fight over, are we enabling? Yeah, we're enabling people to stay alive, which I think is pretty neat. So I'm not really like, Ruth's gonna talk a little bit about the politics of it all. And yeah, that's it for me, for now.
Thank you, Pamela. Excuse me. Yeah, I don't want to get into a political discussion, but I do want to say a few words about the province of Ontario's planned approach with respect to safe consumption sites, or SCSs. As you know, on August 20th, 2024, the Government of Ontario announced plans to defund safe consumption sites that are located within 200 meters of schools and daycare centers, and further, to prohibit the establishment or opening of any new SCSs in Ontario. SCSs will be replaced by homelessness and addiction recovery treatment, or HART hubs, which will favor treatment over harm reduction approaches such as safer supply, SCSs, etc. This means, in practical terms, that about 10 safe SCSs in Ontario will close, and the death toll, already high, from the toxic unregulated drug supply will rise. It is important to understand that SCSs do much more than provide a space for people to use drugs. They do that, and by doing that, they save lives because there are trained staff there who can take action in the event of a problem or an overdose. They connect people to care and services, including housing and treatment, and more are needed, not less. They save and reduce healthcare costs and hospital wait times, which are already, our health system is in a very bad way when it comes to costs and hospital wait times. This will just get worse. They reduce public drug use, public disorder, and public disposal of drug paraphernalia within communities. Research has found overdoses decrease within a 500-meter radius of an SCS and have found no increase or change to crime rates. While the promise of access to treatment via the HART hubs is good for those that are ready for it, it will not include safe space to use or harm reduction supplies such as clean needles, safe syringe disposal, naloxone. Plus, when we consider that not all drug use is problematic and that we are in the midst of a raging toxic drug supply crisis, HART hubs will not prevent deaths or harms due to the toxic supply. And on the resource list, there's a couple of links I included to, there's some petitions going around and there's some articles, and you've maybe seen some in the media about the impact that this will have. So before we open the floor for questions, I would like to say a few words about how the harm reduction principles we've talked about fit with the teachings of Jesus. Jesus challenged structures of discrimination and oppression, and care and compassion for one another were central to his teachings. He talked a lot about seeing and caring for all people, especially those on the edges of society, the hungry, the sick, the homeless. Harm reduction is very much aligned with this, and further, it gives a voice to those at the margins, those subject to discrimination and oppression, who often are not listened to, another important element of Jesus' teachings. As an example, those of you who attended in person or virtually Molly's September 8th sermon will recall that she talked about the story from Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 37, about the Syrophoenician woman who persisted in having her request for healing for her child heard by Jesus. This woman represented someone on the edges of society, an outsider, deemed unworthy by society, and yet Jesus listened to her, gave her his time, and ultimately answered her prayer. In today's world, I believe that we would find Jesus ministering to the people society deems unworthy with care and compassion and no judgment. He would be at the safe injection sites in the downtown east side of Vancouver, in the homeless encampments which are stretching across the province and the country for that matter. And in thinking about today's sermon, I think Jesus would be encouraging us to be the persistent voice and to look past the fear that's keeping us from speaking out for the people on the edges of society that are not being heard or listened to. So that's my little sermon for today.